All right, welcome everyone. My name is Justin Cole. I'm a transportation planner for the Nashville Department of Transportation, and here today for a virtual meeting about our Gallatin Pike and Main Street project. This is something that we've been working on since the end of last year. Um, some of you have probably participated in some of the previous meetings that we've had for the project. Gallatin and Main are among our most dangerous streets. Both were included in the Vision Zero action plan, and so as part of the High Injury Network. So this project is aiming to set a vision to transform the corridor to provide safe and accessible options for all users. As far as what you can expect today, we've got a presentation that we're going to go through, providing some background on the project, where we've been, and where we're at right now. And then we'll have an opportunity for some Q&A afterward. But before we jump into that, did want to take a quick moment to share some information about Choose How You Move. So Choose How You Move is a program based on ideas from over 70 plans that we've completed over the past decade, and incorporating 66,000 pieces of input from the public. It's something that will help us get moving on some of our most pressing transportation needs. Kevin, if you could go to the next slide. Some quick highlights of the Choose How You Move program. This will complete the priority sidewalk network that was identified in Walk and Bike when combined with our regular annual capital spending plan. It's going to upgrade nearly 600 traffic signals across Nashville to help us modernize our traffic signal system in a way we've not had the opportunity to before. It will also enhance transit service across the county, and then along our main corridors, provide 24-hour day, 7-day-a-week service throughout the year. So the other thing that it will do is improve some of the safety of our system, upgrades to intersections, construction of complete street projects on some of our most dangerous streets. So the big thing that you need to know is that voters in Davidson County will have the opportunity to vote on implementing this program on November 5th. If you'll go to the next slide, Kevin. The map here shows the projects and services that are part of the program. If you want to learn more about it, just go to nashville.gov/transit or scan the QR code on your screen. And you can look at an interactive map, kind of zoom in, select out different projects, and get a better understanding of everything that's included. So with that, we'll jump into our main Gallatin presentation, and I'll turn this over to Kevin Tilbury with Kimley Horn, who've been working on this project for us.
Thanks, Justin, and I'd like to echo my gratitude for you all taking your lunch hour to join us today. We're going to cover a little bit of ground today, bring you up to speed on where we've been, and then get into where we are in terms of the recommendations. So we're here to answer your questions, and I'm sure you've probably already got some. What we're going to ask is use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and put your question in there, and we'll start compiling a list of questions. And then once we're finished with the presentation, I promise it won't take that long, then we'll get to start answering some of your questions. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive in. So first, wanted to bring everyone up to speed and remind you what this study is attempting to do. So it's really sort of two projects in one. The first project, which was the initial sort of need, was the fact that there's a project to resurface Main Street. And NDOT had the idea to go ahead and implement some of the projects that are necessary to address some of the concerns on Main Street. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But we knew that was a near-term need that we needed to go ahead and design for. And that project is from 5th and Main all the way up to Eastland on Gallatin Pike. So that's that area you see in purple. But then that's not, the whole corridor is a much bigger piece. So it goes from 5th all the way to Briley Parkway. So on top of that, there's sort of this long-term vision that we're developing for the quarter so that what gets designed on Main Street will be consistent for the entire quarter. So it's really sort of two projects in one. So the project is the whole purpose is to set a long-term vision. So when the projects that get done this year, next year, and the projects that get done in the year ahead, they're all consistent with this vision for what we call a complete street. And what we mean by that is it'll think sort of intentionally about providing safe and accessible options for all users, but that it can be also implemented in a very cost-effective way, knowing that we want to make good use of our resources. So that's sort of the vision, and that's what we're set out to do. So we've been on a journey. I know some of you on this meeting have probably attended meetings in the past. So the good news is we're nearing the end. So we've already had 2 rounds of public engagement. We're now in our 3rd round. We'll talk more about that in a minute, and then where we're going from here. Some of you are very familiar with the quarter because you've been here all along throughout the process. For some of you, this might be your first meeting, your first exposure. So we thought it would be helpful for everyone just to kind of bring you up to speed and remind you why we're actually doing the project. So let's go back and look at some of the data that we've uncovered. And we shared this at the first meeting. Just the fact that there is an existing and real safety need along the corridor. What we're showing here is the number of fatalities over the last 10 years through the end of 2023. And what's remarkable is that since we created this map for our meetings in December, there have been 2 more fatalities on the corridor. So it's irrefutable that there's a safety condition on the corridor. In addition to the fatalities, we also have data on the crashes as well, but just thought we picked this map because it really stands out. Now, part of the reason why we're seeing, such a prevalent safety issue on the corridor is the fact that there's not really a good place to cross the street. You see on the map here that there are stretches of Gallatin Pike and Main Street where you could go as much as half a mile before there's a safe and marked crossing opportunity. So when you see a condition like that, of course, you're going to have a safety issue. There's an organization called Smart Growth America, and through their National Complete Streets Coalition, compiles safety statistics on places in America and then ranks them. And the ranking just came out about 2 weeks ago, and Nashville lands 36 out of a little over 100 metropolitan areas in the United States. So we're not the worst, but we're also not the best. So we're somewhere in the worst third for fatalities. And so this is part of an intentional effort to redesign our streets so that they are safer for people. So another reason why we're seeing the safety condition is speed. So sort of the magic number is 30 miles an hour. Once cars travel above 30 miles an hour, a collision with a pedestrian turns from an injury into a fatality. And so the magic number is 30 miles an hour that we're shooting for, that we want to design a street where motor vehicles move at 30 miles an hour or less. That is in contrast to what we're seeing on the corridor today, is the measured speeds are, 35, 40, and some of the peak speeds are even higher than that, which is another major reason why we see the safety condition that we do on the corridor. There are a lot of driveways in the corridor, as you've probably noticed. That creates a lot of conflicts with turn movements, people coming in and out of places. And so that creates conflicts both within the road and also on the sidewalk. Another reason why we're seeing speeding is just the design of the street. There's a big wide pavement there right now that there's a lot of undefined pavement space, and it's flat and it's straight. And that's a prescription for speed. And that's precisely why we see cars speed. The motor vehicle speeds that we do is because the way that the street is designed. And that has a net effect throughout the corridor, not just in terms of safety, but also just the roadside environment. So for those of you that have, tried to walk on Gallatin Pike and Main Street, and I suspect that many of you have, it's not a comfortable place to be. There's not really a buffer between, we talked about the high speeds that are zooming by. There's no buffer there. There's no furnishing zone, for things like street lighting and planters and things like that. And there's no landscaping. And so the net effect is it's not, unless you have to walk on Gallatin Pike or Main Street, you probably wouldn't choose to because it's not a comfortable place to be right now. So I'm going to show you an example. If you make sure your sound is on so you can hear this. So this is what it's like to walk on Gallatin Pike
It
in
is one of
Main
those
Street right
awkward
now.
offset. Yeah.
So you probably have a hard time hearing me, but that's
Where
what
it's
it's like.
difficult to
It's hard to have a
navigate
conversation if
because of
you're
the
sitting
offset
or
versus the
walking
other
along the
trucks.
street. So that's something that we're going to try and address. All that pavement also contributes to something called the heat island effect, which is the cumulative impact of the built environment, sidewalks, streets, parking lots, all those buildings, all those types of things cumulatively contribute to the heat island effect. And that little blip that you see there is recording of surface temperatures in Nashville on an average afternoon. And that spike you see there, that's Main Street. So we know that there's a condition there that we need to address that's contributing to the heat island effect. At the same time, there's a lot of need in the corridor too. Gallatin Pike is actually the second most popular route, 56, in WeGo's entire system behind Murfreesboro Pike. It gives about 100,000 rides per month, and there's already good service in the corridor, about service every 10 minutes. So the quality of service in terms of frequency is really already there. But once you get on the bus, you're subject to a lot of delays just by the way that traffic operates in the corridor. And so that results in, if you're trying to ride the bus, a delay in your travel time, but also increased operating costs if you're WeGo. We also see, we looked at trip data and trip lengths in the corridor, and we see a lot of trips that are less than a mile in length, or maybe even a couple miles in length. They could, if we provided a safe place for people to walk and bike, they may choose to do that just simply because they're already making a short trip. So it may be, right now, it may be more convenient for them to drive or more comfortable, but in the future, if we can create a place that's safer for people to walk and bike, they may choose to do so. And we're not just doing it for the sake of doing it because we like walking and biking and riding transit, although we do, but there's also a business case to be made. What the data shows is that when you create places that are more accessible for everyone, not just cars, certainly cars, but also people who walk and bike and ride transit, that you'll see a positive business impact as well. And so when you design, really interesting multimodal environments, many modes, you see new investment in the corridor, but you also see existing businesses flourish as well. So there's a business case to be made for it. So that's some of the backgrounds. I'm sure a lot of you joined us back in December when we had our first round of public workshops. And so some of the things that we heard from folks is we gave folks a blank sheet, a blank piece of paper with Main Street and Gallatin Pike, and we gave them a bunch of street sections, and we said, okay, build, you're the designer, build the ideal street that you would like to see on Gallatin Pike and Main Street. And this is sort of a composite of what people told us, is that people said they wanted to see more options. So you see the bike lane, you see, the transit facilities, in addition to, facilities for cars, you see landscaping. So those are all sorts of things that people told us they wanted to see. We also asked people to tell us, what are your priorities for the corridor? What are the things that we need to focus on? And by far, the most important thing that people told us was safe and accessible crossing opportunities. And I think that goes directly back to the slide I showed you at the beginning of all the fatalities on the corridor. And a lot of those are the direct result of crossing at an unmarked location because you have to. And so, even the data shows us, but also you tell us you want better, crossing opportunities. We also heard about a better pedestrian roadside experience, which is also something we covered with you today. Landscaping, better connections to transit, prioritize bus service, but also, making sure that we provide adequate automobile travel as well. So all the things that we see in the data, you guys are telling us as well. So many of you may have participated in the survey or heard about the survey called Imagine Nashville. This was done independent of our study. But what's interesting is they provided insights to individual neighborhoods. And so our corridor is part of East Nashville. And this is when people asked about priorities for their neighborhood, this is what they told us. They said, things like lack of public transportation, walkability, bikeability. Those are all things that they wanted to see in their neighborhood. So we're seeing it in other places too, not just in our study. Again, I'm sure there are questions, so please, if you have a question that comes to mind, go ahead and put it in the chat and we'll get to it here in just a minute. So we took your ideas and we started to sketch out some thoughts for how Gallatin Pike and Main Street could transform. So this is what Main Street looks like today. And one idea that we came up with to transform it was to kind of rethink how we use the lanes and both how we use the roadside environment as well. So, transitioning that outside lane, making it for buses, but then also, providing things like raised medians and bulb outs with marked crossings to get at that crossing issue that we talked about, safe crossing opportunities, and also some really subtle design treatments to make sure that cars move at appropriate speeds. You see like the curvature in the road. Those are things that contribute to those lower speeds. We looked at a second concept that's similar, but one of the main differences is we would convert the two inside lanes to bus lanes. And with this, you also get sort of a raised boarding platform in the middle that can serve not only for boarding transit, but also for crossing in the middle of the street. The other thing that's notable about this design too is both provide bike facilities in certain stretches, but this one, the second one that I'm showing you, provides a continuous bike facility from north to south. So that's the major difference between the two. So we took these ideas and we brought them out to you back in March. So about 2 months ago, 2 or 3 months ago, and we asked, what do you think? We've got these two concepts. Does this work for Gallatin Pike and Main Street? We didn't ask you to pick one or the other, but what we said is tell us what you like and don't like about each one. And so if you were at a public workshop, you probably saw one of these boards. We had something similar that people could do this online, but we showed you a section of the quarter for both of the concepts and said, what do you like and what you don't like? And so here's what we heard. There are a couple of things that resonated throughout the entire process that people told us, no matter what venue we were at. And one was landscaping. So when we showed a picture that had included landscaping, like you see in the image here on the slide, everyone consistently said, yes, that's awesome. We need more of that. We like the landscaping. They also said, yes, we need bike facilities on Gallatin Pike and Main Street. That's a critical need. And they also said, the transit lanes are pretty cool. We like that too. So those are the three things that people resoundingly said they liked. But then they also had some concerns too. So one of the concerns is, you'll notice on the image, we're showing the bike lane and the delineators, but they're not protected. So we heard a lot of feedback that, the bike lanes are great, but there's some stretches of Gallatin Pike that I don't feel safe biking on unless they're protected. So we need more than just the delineators for protection. We also heard some concerns about the traffic impact. So you'll notice that when we put in a bus lane, we trade it out for a general purpose lane. And so there were some concerns that, well, what's this going to do to traffic if this happens? And then there were also some concerns about the center boarding platform, the fact that you had to enter in the middle of the street to board the bus. And that goes directly back, I think, to concerns that we heard about crossing the street. So understandably. We also asked you, we've got limited pavement, so we can't do everything. We've got to make it all fit, within the pavement that's there today. So we wanted to get a sense of what are the elements that are critical to you, that are must-haves, and then what are things that you think might be important, but you're not willing to lose them in order to get something else. So this is what you told us when we asked you that question. The things that you told us, you said are must-haves, that no matter what, you wanted to see bike facilities on the corridor, you wanted to see those frequent mid-block crossings, and then you wanted to see landscaping. So very similar to what I just showed you. Those are the must-haves. What you said was not as important, and we know not everyone has this opinion, but the folks at the meeting said that on-street parking was not as important as some of the other things. And then the ones that were sort of all over the map, where some people said, yes, this is really important, and some people said, no, it's not as important as other things, or things like direct left turns at mid-block locations, and providing raised medians and bulb outs. So those kind of fell somewhere in the middle. All right, so we're going to get to your questions in just a minute, but we want to show you how we've taken that feedback and now we've come up with the recommendations. So let's go ahead and dive in and show you the recommendations. So again, I mentioned, the design of Main Street, and this is the image that we used. And what this says to me, and what it says, I think, to people that drive on the corridor, is that Gallatin Pike and Main Street, this is a place that you want to drive through. So you just want to get through there as quickly as possible. It's not really a place to be. So what our design attempts to do is make it a place, not a place to drive through, but a place to come to. So rethink the street so that it's a place that you want to come and visit, you want to spend time on and walk and do interesting things on. So that's what our design does. So we presented two concepts, and we've kept both concepts as part of our recommendations. Ultimately, we'll need to decide one. That will come at the design phase. We'll talk more about that in a minute in terms of where we're going. So we will have to make a decision on either the image on the left or the image on the right, and that's going to happen during design. So they have some things in common. One is that the fact that they have medians, and those provide several benefits, both in terms of safety from turn movements. We talked about that earlier. It can reduce. The data shows that it reduces crashes, and also for pedestrian crossing. To the extent that we could, we included cycling protection. Remember, that's a comment that we got. So you'll notice that if you take a close look, and we have these in more detail that you can look at in greater detail, but we've installed what are called wheel stops, the things that you see in parking lots to stop you from parking. They can also be repurposed to fit within this little buffer zone to provide an additional layer of protection between the bike lane and the travel lane. So that's something that we added. And then, as you can see, that both include dedicated bus lanes that are going to provide that smoother, more consistent ride for transit. They vary in the image on the left, provides the bus ride in the center, and the image on the right provides it on the curb. And they have their advantages and disadvantages. So one of the advantages of curbside, as you can see here, is that when you take the bus lane and the bike lane into account, it provides 18 feet of separation between the sidewalk and the road. And so if you recall the video that I showed you, that loud traffic, kind of zooming past if you're walking down the street, this is going to create a fundamentally different experience in that, because now you're creating that separation between the traffic and the roadside. So it's going to create a fundamentally different roadside experience if you're walking, but also if you own a business there as well. The other thing that it does too is that the bus lane provides a buffer between the bike lane and traffic too. So it's going to provide a more comfortable cycling experience. We talked about the raised median, and it provides a really important safety benefit for street crossing. And because we've heard so much about how bad it is to cross the street, we wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about that. So this is what that raised median does, combined with the design, is with this design that you see here, you really only have to be exposed to general traffic for about 10 feet at a time for just this lane. So if you contrast that with what it's like today, it's a fundamentally different experience. So this is what it's like to cross Gallatin Pike right now, the image on the right. You've got to cross 50 feet of traffic, and you have to wait for a long enough break in both directions to be able to dart across. Most of the accidents that we see, or the safety issues, are in situations like this. But when you introduce the transit lane and the raised median, it creates a different experience. You cross 10 feet in one direction, you stop in the median, and then you cross 10 feet again. So it's a much more comfortable and safe experience. And that's the number one thing that we heard from people, is we want a better crossing experience, and this achieves that. So one of the things you'll probably notice about medians is that it provides a safety benefit, but because it restricts access. And so we did want to touch on that, on how access would be provided. So this is, you can see this is the concept where the bus lanes run on the outside. So if we were to build some raised medians, they wouldn't be everywhere. They'd be in strategic locations, which means in some locations you might not be able to make a left turn, but in other locations you would be. So you'd be able to do a little bit of both. And then in this case too, cars would make right turns from the bus lane as well. So it's a bus lane, but it's also a business access lane for cars. That second concept, concept B, when transit runs in the middle, you're not going to be able to make left turns across the bus lane. So you won't be able to make mid-block turns into driveways or minor streets. But what you can do is when you get to a signalized intersection, there would be a dedicated phase for you to make a left turn and a U-turn so that you could turn and go into a driveway. Another question that you may have, and it's probably in the Q&A, I haven't looked, is you'll notice that we're repurposing one of the general travel lanes for buses. And so you're probably wondering about what the traffic impacts would be. So we've looked at intersections, and we know there are some specific locations of congestion that would need to be handled for improvements, but we also wanted to sort of talk about the mainline capacity issue too. So what you see on this chart are the average hourly traffic volumes on an average weekday on Gallatin Pike. I think this is between Douglas and Eastland specifically. There are about 24,000 cars per day that travel on that stretch of Gallatin Pike on an average weekday. And what you see here is the breakdown of how that traffic moves on an hourly basis. So it picks up around 7 o'clock and it stays pretty steady and then peaks in the afternoon between 4 and 6. And you can see it gets to a little over 1,700 cars per day. And then it sort of slowly decreases over the course of the evening. Although there's still a good bit of people out late at night. You guys must have a different lifestyle than I do. I'll be in bed by then. But I did want to point out, you see this orange line here. This is the capacity of a 4-lane arterial like Gallatin Pike. It's about 2,700 cars per day. So you can see there's a huge gap right now in mainline capacity between what we're seeing in terms of hourly traffic volumes and what the capacity is. So there's a lot of excess capacity on the corridor right now, which is one of the reasons why you see speeding. So what happens if we take away a lane of traffic? This is the effective capacity now. So it goes from about 2,700 to just under 1,500 cars per day. This is the capacity for a 2-lane urban arterial. So you can see that in those afternoon hours, it's sort of the traffic volumes creep above that capacity. So that's when you might see congestion and it might start to become an issue. But remember, we talked about the potential for people to start walking and biking. So we put that at about 20%, 15 to 20% of the trips right now that are a mile or less in length. Some of those could shift to walking and biking. So let's say half of them do, about 10% shift to walking and cycling. So you can see then the daily volumes would go down. And then also Ellington Parkway. We've looked at trip origins and destinations, and we think about 15 to 20% of trips that are on Gallatin Pike and Main Street right now could just as easily complete their trip on Ellington Parkway. So again, let's be conservative and say about 10% of those shift. So if 10% shift to other modes and 10% go on to Ellington Parkway, well then we're good. We're below the capacity, so we're in a good position. So we feel pretty good about the traffic impacts on Gallatin Pike and Main Street as a result of the design improvements. And I think the other thing that we want to point out too is that this is not, a big part of this is creating safe spaces for walking, for riding a bike, for accessing transit, absolutely. But the bigger picture, again, is that we're making Gallatin Pike and Main Street a place. And that includes people who live on Gallatin Pike and Main Street, but also people who own businesses as well. We want this to be a very successful, thriving street that people want to come to. And so this is what we see as kind of a sneak peek for the long-term vision of the corridor. So this is a business that's opened recently, Tiger Bar, which coincidentally just made, I think, one of the top 50 bars in America list. So it's already gained some popularity. But look at what they decided to do. This is, we talked about the front-loaded parking. So here's the driveway, and this was parking at one point. But this business in particular said, for us, it's more important to provide space for people because that's how our business operates. So we're going to repurpose the parking lot and provide outdoor seating for folks. And so what the goal is if we can change this roadside environment and make it more habitable and more comfortable for people, that more businesses will choose to do this, and it's going to create more of a place for people to be instead of traveling through. So that's the long-term vision. I want to leave you with that. So we've just scratched the surface of the plan. We know that you probably want to look at it in more detail and have more questions. You can go online and we can send you a link to where you can find this information online. But we're also going to go out and have an opportunity for you guys to have a conversation with us about it and get some of your more detailed questions answered. And we've got 3 opportunities for you to do that. We're going to be at WeGo Central 2 different times. We're going to be there this afternoon. So from 2:30 to 4:30 this afternoon, we're going to be at WeGo Central. We're going to be back at WeGo Central again on Wednesday morning from 7 to 9 a.m. So we'll be there in 2 different times. We're going to be at the East Park Community Center in East Nashville on Thursday evening from 5 to 7. And these are drop-ins, so you don't have to get there at 5. If you get off work at 6, come by then. It's a drop-in. There is no official start and stop. We're just going to be there with more information, and you can have a conversation with us. And then the third location is the Inglewood Public Library at the north end of the quarter, and we're going to be there tomorrow at 2 different times. One during lunchtime from 11:45 to 1:45, and then again tomorrow evening from 5:30 to 7:30. So those are 5 different opportunities for you to come out and visit and see us. And then also there's a QR code that you can scan that you can look at this information online as well. Okay, so good news is we're going to get to your questions, but first I wanted to talk a little bit about schedule. So as I mentioned earlier, in construction. So here's where we're at. We're going to finalize the plan this summer. And so we're going to have a conversation with you this week, and then we're going to start to finalize our plans. And then we're going to move for that section from 5th to Eastland. You remember that immediate need that we talked about? We're going to go into design from there. And so that's going to happen late this year, possibly into early 2025. And from there, we're going to go into construction. So you're going to start to see it on the ground in reality over the next year or 2. We don't know exactly when yet, but we do know it's going to be at some point in 2025 or 2026. And then as far as the sections north of Eastland, those are a little more indeterminate. It depends on when the funds can be acquired, and that depends on when that happens. But the exciting news is we will start. I know some of you are probably tired of going to meetings and would like to see action. And the good news is it's close. We're almost there. But I will point out that when we get into the design phase, there will be more opportunities to have public input when we get to that level of detail. So don't worry. Well, Justin, I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add, or Veronica, but I think we're ready to take some of your questions. So I'm going to stop and see what questions we have.
Awesome. Yeah, let's jump in. The first one we have is it possible to consider raised crosswalks?
Yeah, so like Kevin said, a big concern on the corridor is speed. So we'll be looking at a variety of strategies to try and make sure that we're reducing the speed so it's a safer street for all users. Raised crossings may be a possibility. Generally speaking, those aren't compatible with the transit vehicles. That's something that we generally stay away from when transit vehicles are in use. But some of the other features that Kevin was highlighting, some of what's called a chicane effect, where the travel lane is not kind of consistently straight, but it has some areas where it bumps out. Things like that can help again get that speed to where we want it to be.
Awesome, thanks. And another question about pedestrian crossings. We talked about how center running BRT would affect left turns, and someone's wondering, will that affect the frequency of pedestrian crossings as well if there's the center running BRT?
So under both scenarios, we're going to be making sure that we're getting kind of regular crossings. And so that means that sort of in addition to some of the signals that are already out there that have crossings that would be upgraded, there would be other crossings, and regardless, kind of any of those transit stops or stations would have access by crosswalk. So you'd be able to cross the street at any bus stop, but you'd also have regular opportunities to cross the street along the corridor safely.
Yeah, and I'll point out one of the things that we heard in the last round was we wanted to see more landscaping and more medians. So even within that center running design, even where there's not a station or a platform, there will be a raised median in some locations where we have enough pavement to do that. So yes.
Great.
And I'm sorry, let me jump. And that's an example of more detail. If you come out, or if you go on the website, or you come see us, that you can. That's an example of the detail that you can see if you come out.
Awesome. Okay, what is the current width of the road? I think one of the graphics showed 60 feet. And will this project work within existing right-of-way? And if so, is it possible to consider widening, or are we considering widening the street?
Justin, you
So
want me to
the
take that? Oh, you go ahead, Justin.
Okay, yeah, yeah. The width does vary. So there are points where it's narrower than 60, curb to curb. We've kind of looked at a high level at the whole corridor to try and see what fits. Obviously, where it gets a little narrower, some dimensions have to change, and sometimes that causes some constraints. As far as widening, generally we've taken the approach of trying to avoid widening. We recognize that with these concepts, there are going to be a couple of intersections where we might need to widen in order to accommodate everything. But for the most part, we're not trying to do a significant widening because of the kind of cost and disruption associated with that. So for the most part, we are working kind of with that width, but there would be spot areas where it would be widened.
Great. And going along that, you kind of answered it, but are there plans to fix any of the awkward intersections along Gallatin, Maine? And some examples are Eastland and West Eastland, Hart and Greenfield, and Cahal and Carolyn.
Yeah, so we haven't gotten to a great level of detail for anything kind of north of Eastland, but certainly with either of these concepts, when we get into design, we'll be looking at ways we can solve some of the problems that we know exist out there with some of those intersections. For the short term at Eastland, we know that's one of the problem intersections that's a challenge for folks, and so we're as we move into kind of design for that Fifth to Eastland segment, we'll be looking at ways that we can kind of make that work better while also still providing for the multimodal accommodations and making it a street that all users feel comfortable using. So
Great. And so we had another question about Lytton and Trinity intersection where the railroad crossing is. And so similar, we're not to that level of detail, but generally, how do we see the center BRT interacting with the railroad crossing?
So is that a question about the CSX crossing where it goes over?
I think it's the
Gallatin?
underpass. Yes, that's what I would think.
Yeah, so that's and Kevin can jump in here. That's another example of kind of a pinch point in the corridor that we've identified. We haven't gotten into a huge level of detail, but we've looked at some options for the ways that we could kind of creatively work around those pinch points. The other one being kind of that segment of just south of Eastland where it is just currently 4 lanes. So.
Yeah, and you probably noticed when we showed some of the typical sections that that's not going to work there because of the fact that you've got the pilings. And if anyone's ever worked with CSX, it's not easy to get change there. So those are some things that we'll have to work around. So whether that means where there may have to be some shared space between cars and buses in some locations, just in that very specific location, absolutely. But we do acknowledge, and if you've ever tried to walk from north to south or bike from south, from north to south, or actually it's probably more in the northbound direction, it's almost impossible to do so. So the ideas that Justin has said we've been tossing around do include specific facilities that would enable safe and comfortable crossing for bicycles and pedestrians at that underpass.
Yep, and we had a question about if cars can drive in the bus lane, so hopefully that answers your question. If not, you can submit another one. Were street trees considered next to the sidewalk? How are those going to be incorporated in the design?
Yeah, so generally speaking, we were kind of focused on what we could do between the curbs to make better use of that space. Of course, we've also been in conversations with the Metro Planning Department about, how this would impact kind of the current corridor plan and the opportunities that exist through, current major and collector street plan and through revisions that we could make to implement more of the street trees kind of between the curb and the sidewalk, either through redevelopment or through other, sidewalk projects. Again, particularly since we have the opportunity to do something relatively quick between Fifth and Eastland. We weren't focused again on widening there to do that. So we've put focus on adding landscaping through features like a planted buffer from the bikeway or through the medians that Kevin was talking about. But yes, there's, I think, great opportunity in the future to do things that add that additional landscaping and buffer between the curb and the sidewalk.
And before we jump to the next question, I did want to offer a little clarification on the question before that about can cars operate in the bus lane? And so the answer is for center running, the answer is no, that those are dedicated bus lanes. Now, it's at the signalized intersections, there would be an opportunity, there will be dedicated left turn lanes for cars because we know that's something that needs to happen. So there would be that. And then when the bus operates the curbside, that cars that are making right turns at intersections or to go into businesses, they're allowed to use the bus lane for that purpose. And so that's one of the trade-offs when you talk, when you think about curb versus center, is that it's more efficient for buses to operate in the middle because they're not operating with the cars turning right. So that's one of the, I guess, trade-offs of the two.
Great, thank you. Okay, we have some questions on clarifying how limiting left turn access and U-turns will interact with that. People saying they don't think there's going to be enough space to do a U-turn with the one travel lane in the opposite direction. Do you have any points of clarification on how that will work?
Yeah, so with either concept, we're using medians in order to improve safety, to take some of those places where we see a lot of the crashes from the conflicting left turn movements and kind of close that off. With the option where the bus lanes are curb running, there would still be places where you could make left turns. To your point, it doesn't provide enough room to make a U-turn. With the center running bus lanes, because you have the bus lanes in the center and in some cases, a boarding platform as well, there is enough room to make U-turns. And so with the center running bus lanes, again, there wouldn't be any kind of left turns between the signalized intersections, but at those major intersections where you have a signal, there would be a left turn, dedicated left turn lane that would also facilitate U-turns. And so each one has kind of different impacts in terms of how you would get to certain locations where left turns would no longer be direct. In some cases, that might be making the block, that sort of thing, or with the center running, you would also have that opportunity to make a U-turn, and so that would be the way.
Perfect. All right, moving to bike facilities, can you speak to the continuity of bike lanes in the two concepts, center running versus curb running, and if the bike lane's in the middle versus on the sides?
You want me to
Yeah, Kevin,
just,
yeah.
yeah, so so concept B, the one where buses operate in the center, under that concept, there would be provisions for a dedicated bike facility for the entire length. Generally speaking, north of CSX, so the north part would be, there's enough pavement width there to have that. Remember the image that we showed of the bike protection? There is enough right of way there to make that happen. To have that protection. Once you get south of CSX, the curb narrows, the pavement isn't quite as wide. So we can provide a bike lane there, it just wouldn't be protected. Which is not ideal, but that's, that we're kind of working within the limited amount of pavement. And then once you get a little bit south into Main Street, we've got a design for a protected bikeway within there. Let me actually, why don't I let's see if I have an example I can show you. Here, let me share the screen real quick. So this
And
is
well,
this. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, while you're bringing that up, one of the things, because of that middle segment needing to be an unprotected bike lane, we've looked at alternative kind of neighborhood routes, knowing that not all riders would be comfortable with that. But how can we provide kind of a parallel route through the neighborhoods? But yeah.
So that's what that's what we're showing here is the so this is that protected bikeway. And then this is this is south of CSX to Eastland that I was referring to, where we've only got 50 feet of pavement here. And so there's not enough right of way to put protection in, but we can get a bike lane. And then once you get north of CSX, then you see that bike lane protection there. The wheel stop, and that's true. The protection is true both for for north of CSX, both are protected bike lanes, whether it's curb running or center running. There's enough pavement width to do that. Then once we get south of CSX to Eastland, there's just not enough pavement width to provide a bike lane within this section, but there is for concept B. And then once you get to Main Street, both have bike lanes. The curb running is not protected, but it is the bus lane does buffer between the bike lane and the road. And then the center running does have that protection. Let's see if I can find that map that here we go. So this is the map that Justin was referring to. We've mapped out a series of neighborways. So these are low speed, low volume streets that are comfortable to cycle on. And it would tie into the Spokes project that many of you are familiar with, the bikeway project on Woodland. So this is a much more comfortable ride, but it's also a little circuitous, a little bit out of the way. So it's not as ideal if you want a direct route. Okay, I hope they answered the question.
Okay, speaking of parallel routes, especially for bike facilities, are there any plans to redesign surrounding streets like Woodland, or those in between Main and Woodland?
Yeah, and so that's that East Nashville Spokes project, which you can go onto our website and see more information on that. That is getting ready to move into design later this year. But it is a plan to redesign Woodland Street, South 10th, South 5th, with new bike facilities, pedestrian improvements, landscaping. So that's one big one. We've also got, other neighborhood bikeway projects that you can learn about from our bikeways tracker online. Also our sidewalks tracker. So yeah, there's other ways you can kind of learn about some of the other projects we have going on.
Perfect. Okay, will NES power lines be reconfigured to be underground?
That is not a part of the current plan.
As much as we would love for it to be, that is correct. Yeah,
Okay.
it's very expensive to do that. And it may be part of the future plans, but not part of this project.
Great. We have several questions about protecting the dedicated bus lane and enforcing the dedicated bus lane. What are our plans for that?
Yeah, so this is where there's kind of some difference between the two. The center running bus lane is generally easier to keep, drivers out of, and so there's less of a need for enforcement there. With the curb running, particularly in locations where there are lots of places where people are going to make right turns, drivers are going to be able to use it. So it does create a little bit more of an enforcement challenge. We've got an enforcement team that's regularly doing kind of parking violations and that sort of thing. We'll also be looking, this would be some of our, first bus lanes in Nashville. And so we'll be looking to peer cities and what they've done and the successes that they've had and challenges that they've had to try and make sure we can keep it functioning as intended.
And I mean, that's a great question. As Justin mentioned, other cities have had that same issue that have implemented the curb running bus lanes, and they've had success. Starting first with education and then with enforcement. So, obviously when you just implement it, there's going to be a lot of questions around it. People aren't quite sure how to use it. And that's where the education part comes in. And then eventually it becomes an enforcement issue. But places like Washington, D.C. Have had a lot of success doing that. And they've gotten the lanes to operate as they should and people generally follow the rules once they understand what they are. So they've had a good experience with that.
And you kind of answered this one, but someone asked if there is an example of a successful plan, preferably local, which not in Nashville currently, where this type of transition has taken place or some data on results. So Washington, D.C., any others you would point them to?
Well, I'll point them to Gallatin Pike and Main Street in about 2 years. But until then, another good example would be the Pulse BRT in Richmond, which is another example where they've repurposed a street for busways, and it's worked really well for them. That would be, I think, probably the best example to look at. And if you Google it, you can go in and see, and it works really well.
All right. Back to clarifying the intersection between Lytton and Trinity. They're back with some clarification that said both directions of traffic flow between Lytton and Trinity must utilize the center lane for left turns. Lytton is a bypass road for McGavick's railroad crossing, and a large portion of drivers choose Lytton over McGavick because it is more predictable.
Yeah, okay. And that is, again, one of those things that would have to be looked at more closely in design. Certainly with, with any place where we have signals that are pretty close together, that could be a challenge for the left turning movements. And so there's a variety of ways we could, modify things, but we would get into those details as we get more into design.
And that's exactly why we're still leaving the both concepts open, is because we need to be able to get to that level of design to make that decision. So if we think that there's not a good way to provide mid-block left turns, then we need to use the curb running option so that we can have mid-block left turns, then that's what we'll do. But if we think that we can successfully do it without the mid-block left turns and everything else makes sense, then maybe we'll go with the center running concept.
All right. Is this Main Street Gallatin Pike vision plan, and specifically the portion between 5th and Eastland, dependent on in any way on the transit referendum passing in November?
So Gallatin Pike is included in Choose How You Move as an all-access corridor, and so we are kind of envisioning this as an opportunity for early implementation. We intend to move forward with a project on that 5th to Eastland segment regardless. What I'll say is that there will potentially be budget challenges, and so the scale of the implementation is something that will need to be looked at. And so we might not be able to implement everything that you're seeing here just based on available funding. And that, maybe we could, maybe we couldn't, but yeah, that's kind of where we're at.
Great, thanks. Okay, we have 5 more minutes, so maybe 2 or 3 more questions. Back to the question on the traffic study and kind of shifting modes of transportation. Just, I guess, touch on the growth factor and growth percentage you use to determine that. And is it reasonable with how fast Nashville is growing to assume a mode shift like that?
You want me to take that? Oh, go ahead.
Well, yeah, I'll let you chime in. I'll just start by saying, I mean, generally speaking, what we see in other cities is when you have the growth that is kind of densification, that tends to make multimodal, work better because you have more destinations that are walking and biking distance. And so we do see as cities densify, more people walking, biking, taking transit, et cetera. But yeah, Kevin, I'll toss it over to you.
Well, yeah, I mean, you bring up a good point. So we did a study of Midtown Atlanta, and what we found is that we looked at the amount of development over a 10 or 20-year period, and then we also looked at traffic. And what we found is that they added about 20 million square feet of stuff. And if you've been to Atlanta, you see all the construction, it's all in Midtown. But traffic did not, if you looked at the volumes on the surface streets, they did not increase. Despite the 20 million square feet of development that went in, and it's specifically because of the environment that was created, a lot of those trips the short trips could shift to walking and biking, and that's exactly what happened in Midtown. And so that's sort of the concept that we're suggesting here, is that some of the trips will shift to walking and biking and transit, and then some will also shift to Ellington Parkway.
All right. Next, we have, how will this project interact with the East Bank plans and connect with the East Bank? Better biking options along Main and Gallatin are great, but they really need to connect to the East Bank.
Yeah, that's a great point. We've been in conversation with the East Bank team. In addition to East Bank, we just completed our Connect Downtown study. And so we've got kind of a whole plan for transit priority corridors through downtown, mobility centers at key locations, a bikeway network. And so, yeah, there's several pieces, but we are kind of coordinating those pieces so that we can make sure that that we have that kind of complete corridor.
And probably most importantly, most of you have probably heard of the multimodal hub on the East Bank, and that's between Main and Woodland, which is directly where our project ties in. So yes, that you will have an opportunity to tie into that hub through this project, which is great.
Yep. All right. Would the number of bus stops decrease under this design with fewer and nicer boarding opportunities, or a similar number that exists now with some stops with more infrastructure and some with less?
So that's something that we'll coordinate with WeGo. They've been involved as a partner on this project, and so we've been working with them closely. And certainly as we get into the design for 5th to Eastland, we'll be working through that. I think, based on the conversations, generally speaking, there may be some consolidation. Their stop spacing is around 1/3 of a mile, which is, fairly consistent. You generally see 1/3 to 1/2 a mile for kind of bus rapid transit like systems like this. So we'll be looking at those opportunities for, shifting stops to where they make sense. But then, certainly with, particularly with the center running concept, that would kind of provide, a much higher level, nicer station than kind of the current situation out on Main Street. And so, yeah, Kevin's got a great image of what that could look like. So.
And for curb running, because of the amount of right of way that is available there, you're probably looking. See if I can find it. I don't know if I've got one here, but it will be more like the standard WeGo shelter, and that's simply because there's not a lot of right of way on the side of the road right here. Here's an example. So there'll be a shelter, but it won't be significantly different than what you see today, at least not in the near term.
And those would probably look similar to some of the bus stops on Nolensville Pike if you've been out there, where the bike lane raises up at the bus stop and you have a shelter on the sidewalk.
Right there. Yep.
So yeah. And then those, in the future, again, could be upgraded to larger stations, but that requires that additional right of way. So.
Awesome. Well, we are at time. We have many more questions, so please try to stop by some of our drop-in sessions this week, and we can email out more information on those after this webinar.
Thanks, everyone. If you could, we've got the locations up there on the screen. If you want to take a screenshot or take a picture with your camera, we'd love to see you at one of these and answer some of your questions more in detail. And there's also a provision to provide comments on the website as well if you go and look at it there. So thanks again for your time. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks.